I think it's amazing that God is able to use Satan to beat Satan. Look at this. Paul, he says that it was a messenger from Satan that he pleaded with the Lord, but God had sent him this messenger from Satan. But amazingly, God is using this messenger from Satan to keep Paul from the very conceit and very pride that Satan would have been tempting him with in the first place. Well, hello and welcome back to the Pastor's Q&A. I am Pastor Ryan here to answer a question about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Here's what it says. It says, "Good morning. Like many people, I struggle with chronic body pain. This morning, I turned to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 for comfort. But it made me question, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Was it physical pain or a spiritual weakness or what?" And so what I want to do is I want to read this in context in the book of 2 Corinthians here, chapter 12, and then we will dive into it. Starting in chapter 12, verse 7. It says, "To keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" So there's been a lot of speculation over the years about what Paul is talking about when he mentions this thorn in the flesh. A few different categories that we can break some of the speculation into. One is this is a psychological thorn in the flesh. We know for sure, just because of the metaphoric language in 2 Corinthians here, that Paul's not talking about a literal thorn. He's not talking about the thorn from a rose or a blackberry bush or something like that. But this is a metaphorical thorn that could relate to something psychological. So, for example, temptation, physical temptation could be the thorn in the flesh. Or there's been speculation about Paul wrestling or struggling with guilt or grief over his past persecutions when he was persecuting Christians. It could be psychological. It could be the opponents that are opposing Paul. Paul's constantly talking about different people that are opposing him. For example, a guy named Alexander the coppersmith in 2 Timothy 4:14, Paul says that Alexander did a great deal of harm to him. Third category, it could be demonic harassment. It says that it's a messenger from Satan, and so some type of psychological or demonic oppression or opposition. Or lastly, and I think most likely, the thing that most commentators look to is some type of physical ailment or physical issue. It could be something like bad eyesight, for example. Paul had to dictate many of his letters, and sometimes it's only at the end he says, "I write this in my own hand," and that's used to speculate that Paul probably had bad eyes. It said that Paul may have had consistent migraine headaches. He may have had malaria and had malaria fever connected to that. All sorts of different things that have been speculated. And so that might be one of the more likely views, but I think that the author of 2 Corinthians, Paul, I think that he keeps it intentionally vague so that his experience with the thorn in the flesh can relate to all of our experience with our thorns, with our thistles, with the things that cause us harm, or the things that are difficult and cause us to need to rely on the Lord. And so that is why Paul keeps it as that ambiguous thorn in the flesh. But what I want to talk about, though, that's even more important than what the thorn is why is the thorn there? Why is Paul given this thorn? And it says it right there in verse 7. It says, "To keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh." And so why was the thorn given to Paul? Humility. Paul was experiencing these amazing revelations. I mean, he was personally called by Jesus, who personally appeared to him and appointed him as a messenger to the Gentiles to spread the gospel, to write a huge portion of the New Testament, most of the epistles that we have in the New Testament. And so that would naturally lead him to be boastful, lead him to be prideful. And so Paul says that that is why God gave him this thorn in the flesh, to keep him humble because of these amazing things, these theological revelations and theological knowledge that he has been accumulating. And what you see is that oftentimes when we come to God, when people come to God, especially if they're going to serve Him, there can be a laming that takes place. And so think about the story of Jacob, for example. Jacob, before he was really able to step into the promise that God had for him, it says that darkness fell and he wrestled with a man, and the man touched his hip socket and put it out of joint. And so he permanently had this limp for the rest of his life. And then it says later that he wrestled with God and lived. And so Jacob, for the rest of his life, was living with this constant reminder of his need to depend on God, his need to get grace from God. Jacob, at that point, he was a very self-made man. He was crafty, he was witty, he knew how to get things done, he knew how to be shrewd in investments. And God lamed him so that he would have a constant need of dependence. And what you see is that in the case of Jacob and in the case of Paul, God is giving them, and sometimes giving us, a small pain in order to help us avoid a much bigger pain later down the road. And so, whatever pain Paul is dealing with, Jacob's experience with his hip, that would have been painful, that would have been difficult, that would have been a trial. But the kind of pride that Jacob was walking in, or the kind of conceit that Paul was tempted to walk in here, that is something that can destroy a ministry. That is something that can tear apart a family. That is something that can disrupt you at an identity level and destroy the rest of your life. And so God, in his graciousness, is allowing this messenger from Satan to affect Paul in this way, to keep him from becoming conceited and keep him on the path that God has for him. And God can often do the same thing in our life as well. And Paul, you see all through the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul is intentionally, he's inverting the categories of power and inverting the categories of what the world looks to. The Corinthians, it says right in the beginning of 1st Corinthians, it says many of them were saying, well, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Christ. They were looking to these human leaders. They were looking to these dynamic speakers and trying to latch themselves onto that. And don't we experience the same temptation? Don't we have a tendency to want to look to Christian celebrities, or the ones who are the most charismatic, or those who are accruing as much political power as possible at whatever the cost? But Paul says that the kingdom's categories are different from that. He says, I'm not going to look at my strength. He says, I'm going to boast in what? My weakness. Because when I am weak, then I am strong. This is completely different to what the rest of the world looks to for a sense of clout and a sense of attention and what we should be devoting ourselves to. And so Paul is inverting these categories. And then lastly, I think it's amazing that God is able to use Satan to beat Satan. Look at this. Paul, he says that it was a messenger from Satan that he pleaded with the Lord, but God had sent him this messenger from Satan. But amazingly, God is using this messenger from Satan to keep Paul from the very conceit and very pride that Satan would have been tempting him with in the first place. This is not the first time that you see this. You see in the book of Job, God using Satan to flip Satan on his head, and especially you see this at the cross. You see this with Judas. It says that Satan entered Judas and caused him to go to the religious leaders and betray Jesus. But then in the book of Colossians, one of the things that it says the cross accomplished was it disarmed the spiritual powers and authorities. And so Satan was the one who entered into Judas, and God used Satan's bad intentions in order to disarm and destroy Satan himself. And that's exactly what he's doing in the life of Paul, and that's what he can do in your life as well. Even if it's a messenger from Satan, even if it's a thorn in the flesh that is affecting you, God will use that so that you will know that his grace will be sufficient for you, and that his power will be made perfect in weakness. This is an amazing promise. Paul is able to experience a depth of joy and a depth of sufficiency and a depth of contentment that he would not have known otherwise had this thorn in the flesh not existed and not affected Paul. And so, in closing, how do we get there? How do we get to the place where we're able to say, like Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness? How can we lay hold of that promise? We recognize that Paul, he had a thorn in the flesh. You might have a thorn in the flesh, but Jesus took a crown of thorns. Jesus took a spear in his side so that his grace would be sufficient for you and so that his power would be made perfect in weakness. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Pastor's Q&A. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. We're also online at radiantofcamus.org. You can submit a question, text it in, or email pastorsqa@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook or Instagram, and we'll see you next time.